The worst kind of betrayal isn't the one you see coming. It's the one that arrives on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while you're standing in line for coffee, thinking your life is finally starting to make sense. My name is Charlotte Bennett, and 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly where my future was headed. I was 26 years old, working as a marketing coordinator in downtown Chicago, sharing an apartment with my boyfriend of 4 years, and saving for a ring I was convinced would appear before Christmas. Ethan Walker wasn't perfect. Nobody is. He worked too much, forgot important dates, and had a habit of answering work emails during dinner. But he was familiar. Safe. The person I built my adult life around. At least that's what I believed. The coffee shop smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon when my phone buzzed against the countertop. I remember that detail because everything else became a blur afterward. The message came from an unknown number. No greeting. No explanation. Just a single photo attached beneath 6 words. Thought you deserved to know. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. Maybe some instinct deep inside me already understood what my mind wasn't ready to accept. I tapped the image. The world stopped moving. Ethan stood outside a restaurant I recognized near the Riverwalk. His arm was around a woman I'd never seen before. They weren't standing too close by accident. They weren't caught in an unfortunate angle. The look on his face told the entire story. He was smiling the way he used to smile at me, like the person in front of him was the only thing in the room worth seeing. I stared at the screen so long that the coffee barista called my name twice. My hands felt numb. My chest felt hollow. Not broken. Not shattered. Just empty. Like someone had quietly removed all the air from my life without making a sound. I wanted to believe it was fake. I wanted to think there was some explanation waiting around the corner. But deep down I already knew. Because for months things had felt different. The late meetings. The canceled weekends. The distracted conversations where his eyes drifted somewhere far away. I told myself. Relationships went through seasons. I told myself adulthood was complicated. The truth was simpler. He had already left. I just hadn't realized I was the last person to know. I walked out of the coffee shop without touching my drink. The November wind hit my face like cold water. Cars moved through downtown traffic. People laughed. Someone walked a golden retriever across the street. The city continued exactly as it had 5 minutes earlier. Meanwhile, my future had quietly collapsed inside a photo. I called Ethan. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. By the 4th attempt, I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for proof. Proof that he would lie. Proof that he would pretend. Proof that the man I loved no longer existed. An hour later, he finally texted back. In a meeting. Everything okay? I actually laughed. Right there on a crowded sidewalk. Because sometimes pain is so ridiculous that laughter becomes the only available response. I looked at the photo one more time. Then at his message. Then back at the photo. My fingers trembled as I locked my screen. For 4 years I had built my life around Ethan Walker. For 4 years I believed loyalty guaranteed safety. I was wrong. And although I didn't know it yet, that single photograph was about to lead me toward the most unexpected chapter of my life. A chapter that began with betrayal and ended with a man kneeling in the rain, wishing he had never let me go. For the next 3 days I avoided my apartment as much as possible. I stayed late at work. I volunteered for projects nobody wanted. I found reasons to walk an extra 6 blocks before going home. Anything to delay the conversation I knew was coming. Ethan acted like nothing had changed. That was the part that hurt the most. He kissed my cheek before work. He asked what I wanted for dinner. He complained about traffic and laughed at television commercials. Every normal moment felt like a performance. Every smile felt borrowed. By Friday evening, I could barely look at him without remembering that photograph. Then his mother called. Charlotte, you are still coming tomorrow night, right? I closed my eyes. The Walker Foundation Gala. I had completely forgotten. Every year, the Walker family hosted a charity event at one of Chicago's most exclusive hotels. Hundreds of guests attended. Business leaders, politicians, journalists, people whose names appeared on skyscrapers and hospital wings. Ethan loved those events. I hated them. Not because anyone was rude. The opposite, actually. Everyone was so polished that I always felt like an imposter wearing borrowed confidence. I almost said no. I almost invented a headache or a work emergency. But something stubborn inside me refused to disappear. If Ethan could smile through his lies, then I could survive one gala. Saturday arrived cold and gray. The kind of November afternoon where the sky looked unfinished. I spent nearly an hour staring at dresses hanging in my closet. Eventually, I chose a navy blue gown I had worn once before. Simple, elegant, safe. When I stepped into the living room, Ethan looked up from his phone and smiled. "You look beautiful." The compliment landed like a stone. Once upon a time, those words would have made my heart race. Now they only reminded me that he had probably said the same thing to someone else. The ballroom occupied the top floor of the Grand Monarch Hotel. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and champagne. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked perfect, which was probably why I felt so out of place. Ethan disappeared almost immediately after we arrived. Networking, he called it. Shaking hands. Making connections. Building opportunities. I watched him blend effortlessly into conversations while I stood near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched for miles beneath the darkening sky. Beautiful. Distant. Unreachable. "You look like you would rather be anywhere else." The voice came from beside me. Deep. Calm. Controlled. I turned and nearly forgot how to breathe. The man standing there looked familiar, though not because I had ever met him. Everyone in Chicago knew who Alexander Walker was. 40 years old. Chief Executive Officer of Walker Enterprises. Ethan's uncle. Business magazines called him brilliant. Financial reporters called him untouchable. Social media called him mysterious. The one thing everyone seemed to agree on was that Alexander Walker never attended events unless absolutely necessary. Yet here he was, standing 6 feet away from me with one hand tucked into the pocket of an impeccably tailored black suit. His expression was unreadable. His eyes were sharp enough to make me feel transparent. I managed a nervous smile. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention," he replied. Then his gaze drifted toward the crowd where Ethan stood laughing with a group of investors. Something flickered across Alexander's face. Not judgment. Not curiosity. Something else. Something I could not quite identify. And for reasons I still cannot explain, I had the sudden feeling that this man saw far more than he ever said. I should have walked away after that conversation. Any reasonable person would have. Alexander Walker was not the kind of man people casually talked to at charity galas. He was the kind of man people prepared for. The kind of man entire rooms adjusted themselves around without realizing it. Yet somehow, 30 minutes later, I was still standing beside him near the window while Chicago glittered below us like a field of scattered diamonds. We talked about everything except the things that actually mattered. The city, work, travel, books. The strange way Lake Michigan looked almost silver under winter clouds. It should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt surprisingly easy. Maybe because Alexander never seemed interested in impressing anyone. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. That alone made him different from most people at events like this. Especially different from Ethan lately. Across the ballroom, I could see Ethan laughing with a group of executives. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward us. The first few times I ignored it. Eventually, it became impossible not to notice. Alexander noticed too. "Your boyfriend seems distracted tonight," he said calmly. The observation caught me off guard. I followed his gaze toward Ethan. Maybe he is just busy. Maybe. His tone revealed nothing. A waiter passed carrying sparkling water. Alexander took one glass and handed it to me before taking another for himself. "Thank you," I said. "You look like you needed it." I laughed softly despite myself. Was it really that obvious? "Charlotte, you have spent most of the evening staring out that window like you are trying to escape through it." The fact that he used my first name startled me more than it should have. Not because it sounded inappropriate, because somehow it sounded familiar, comfortable, dangerous in a way I could not explain. Before I could respond, an older businessman approached Alexander. The change in the room was immediate. The man's posture straightened. His smile became nervous, respectful, almost cautious. Alexander greeted him politely and introduced me without hesitation. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes before the man excused himself. I watched him disappear into the crowd. Does everyone act like that around you? I asked. Like what? Like they are attending a final exam they forgot to study for. For the first time that evening, I saw the corner of Alexander's mouth lift slightly. Not quite a smile. Close enough. Occupational hazard. The answer should have sounded arrogant. Somehow it did not. Another hour passed. The ballroom slowly grew louder as the evening continued. Music drifted through the air. Glasses clinked. Conversations blended together into a soft hum. Yet standing there beside Alexander felt oddly separate from everything around us, as if we occupied some small quiet space nobody else could enter. Then my phone vibrated. A message from Ethan. Where are you? I stared at the screen. 10 seconds later another message arrived. Looking for you. My stomach tightened. Not because of concern, because of timing. For most of the evening he had barely acknowledged my existence. Now suddenly he was looking for me. I slipped the phone back into my purse. Everything okay? Alexander asked. I nodded too quickly. He studied me for a moment. Not pushing. Not prying. Just observing. The way someone watches storm clouds gathering in the distance. And in that moment, standing beneath crystal chandeliers with Chicago shining beyond the glass, I had the strange feeling that Alexander Walker already knew something about my life was falling apart. The terrifying part was that he seemed to be waiting for me to realize it too. The gala ended later than I expected. By the time guests began drifting toward the exits, snow had started falling outside the hotel windows in slow, quiet spirals. Chicago looked softer beneath the white glow of streetlights. Less intimidating. Less sharp. Unfortunately, my life felt exactly the opposite. I finally found Ethan near the coat check. His smile appeared the moment he saw me, practiced and effortless. There you are. I have been looking everywhere for you. The words should have sounded comforting. Instead they felt rehearsed. Like lines from a script I no longer believed. The drive home was strangely silent. Ethan talked about business opportunities, future promotions, and people he had met that evening. I watched the city pass beyond the passenger window and answered when necessary. Nothing more. Every red light reflected across the glass like tiny warning signals. Every mile felt longer than the last. When we reached the apartment, Ethan disappeared into the shower while I stood alone in the kitchen staring at my phone. The photograph was still there. I had not deleted it. I could not. It felt like evidence from a trial that had not happened yet. My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I opened my messages and typed 3 words. We need to talk. His reply came less than 10 seconds later. Can it wait until tomorrow? I stared at those words and suddenly felt exhausted. Not angry. Not heartbroken. Just tired. 4 years of effort. 4 years of compromise. 4 years of building a future with someone who could look me in the eye and ask for one more day. I switched off my phone and went to bed. Sleep never came. Sometime after midnight, I found myself standing by the living room window watching snow collect on parked cars below. The city was silent. The apartment was silent. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to stop pretending. Tears came without warning. Not dramatic. Not uncontrollable. Just quiet. Honest. The kind of tears that arrive when denial finally leaves the room. I do not know how long I stood there before my phone vibrated again. Unknown number. My stomach tightened. Slowly I answered. Hello? Charlotte. The familiar voice surprised me immediately. Alexander. For a moment neither of us spoke. I wondered how he had gotten my number. Then I remembered who he was. A man like Alexander Walker probably had access to information most people never would. I should have found that unsettling. Somehow I did not. I hope I am not calling too late, he said. You are not. That was technically true. I had not slept at all. There was a brief pause. Then he asked a question nobody else had asked all week. Are you okay? Such a simple sentence. 4 words. Yet it nearly broke me. Because he was not asking out of obligation. He was not asking because etiquette required it. He sounded like he genuinely wanted the answer. I looked out at the falling snow. No, I admitted quietly. I do not think I am. The silence that followed felt different from the silence inside my apartment. Warmer somehow. Less lonely. Alexander did not rush to fill it with advice. He did not offer solutions. He simply stayed on the line. And for reasons I still could not explain that mattered more than anything. Outside, snow continued drifting across the sleeping city. Inside, for the first time since receiving that photograph, I felt something unexpected. Not happiness. Not hope. Just the faintest sense that maybe my story was not ending after all. Maybe it was only beginning. The next morning felt strangely lighter, and that scared me more than the heartbreak had. I sat at my desk on the 22nd floor of a downtown office building, staring at spreadsheets I could not remember opening. Outside, December sunlight reflected off glass towers and patches of snow along the streets below. Inside, my phone remained silent. No messages from Ethan. No calls. No explanations. Around noon, a text finally appeared. "Can we talk tonight?" I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking it again. For years together, and suddenly he wanted to talk. Not when I needed honesty. Not when I needed answers. Only when he sensed something changing. That evening, I arrived home first. The apartment felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to two strangers pretending to share a life. When Ethan walked through the front door, his expression immediately shifted. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. "Charlotte, we need to clear up some misunderstandings." The word misunderstandings almost made me laugh. I folded my arms and looked at him. "Is that what you call it?" His confidence faltered. For the first time, he looked nervous. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Excuses. Half-truths. Promises. He insisted it had meant nothing. He insisted it was over. He insisted he loved me. I listened quietly until he ran out of explanations. Then I showed him the photograph. The silence that followed said more than anything else. Eventually, I picked up my coat and walked out. I needed air. I needed distance. I needed a version of myself that existed before disappointment became a permanent roommate. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I wandered through downtown Chicago without a destination. Christmas lights decorated storefronts. Couples carried shopping bags. Taxi horns echoed between buildings. Life continued moving forward. I was the only one standing still. My phone rang unexpectedly. "Alexander." I hesitated before answering. "Rough evening?" he asked. Somehow, he already sounded as if he knew the answer. You could say that. A few moments later, I found myself sitting in a quiet corner of a hotel lounge overlooking the river. Alexander arrived 10 minutes after I did. No entourage. No assistance. No display of power. Just a man in a charcoal overcoat carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me before taking the seat across from mine. We talked for hours. Not about Ethan. Not about betrayal. Not about mistakes. We talked about childhood dreams, career failures, books that changed our lives, the strange loneliness that success sometimes creates. Felt easy, natural, dangerous in a way I could not explain. For the first time in weeks, I forgot to be sad. Then everything changed. Near midnight, my phone lit up. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. Before I could silence it, Alexander glanced down and recognized it. His expression remained calm, but something sharpened in his eyes. "You should answer," he said quietly. I did. Ethan's voice arrived immediately. "Charlotte, where are you?" I looked across the table at Alexander. The city lights reflected behind him like stars scattered across dark water. Suddenly, I understood exactly why Ethan sounded afraid. Because for the first time since he betrayed me, I was no longer standing alone. And somewhere deep down, he had finally realized he might actually lose me. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into an entirely different life. Not because everything suddenly became easier. It did not. My relationship with Ethan was effectively over, even if neither of us had officially used the words yet. We existed in the same apartment like distant neighbors sharing a lease neither wanted to discuss. Every conversation felt careful. Every silence felt loud. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening. Alexander kept appearing. Not in dramatic ways. Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts. He simply showed up. One Tuesday morning, I mentioned during a phone call that my favorite independent bookstore was closing after 40 years. The following weekend, I found him there browsing history books while pretending it was a coincidence. A week later, I complained about a presentation at work that had me stressed beyond reason. That evening, he sent a short message. "You are more prepared than you think." For some reason, those 6 words calmed me more than an hour of reassurance from anyone else could have. The strangest part was how quickly people began noticing. My coworkers noticed. My friends noticed. Even complete strangers seemed to notice. There was something impossible to ignore about Alexander Walker paying attention to someone like me. One Friday afternoon, my friend Megan nearly dropped her coffee when I mentioned having lunch with him. "Wait, the Alexander Walker? The Alexander Walker?" I laughed. "Apparently there is only one. Charlotte, that man has spent 15 years avoiding every woman in Chicago. There are articles about it." I rolled my eyes. "Exaggerations." "No," she insisted. "Seriously. Nobody knows anything about his personal life. Nobody. Yet somehow he keeps finding reasons to spend time with you." Her words stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Because she was right. Alexander never seemed interested in anyone else's attention. Yet whenever I looked up, there he was, calling to ask how my day had gone, inviting me to quiet dinners where conversation mattered more than appearances. Listening. Actually listening. One snowy evening in late December, we walked along the Chicago River after dinner. Holiday lights reflected across the water in long ribbons of gold and white. The cold air turned every breath into a cloud. We moved slowly beneath the glow of street lamps while traffic hummed in the distance. "You know, people talk about you," I said. Alexander smiled faintly. "I would be disappointed if they did not. I mean the stories, the reputation, the mystery." He shook his head. "Most people prefer stories to reality." "And what is the reality?" For several moments he said nothing. Then he looked toward the river. "The reality is that I spent most of my life focused on work because it was easier than letting people get close." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. It was not rehearsed. It was not polished. It sounded real. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. "Ethan." Again. The 7th call that week. I stared at the screen without answering. Alexander noticed but said nothing. He never pressured. Never demanded. Never tried to control my choices. Somehow that restraint made his presence even more powerful. As I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I realized something that should have frightened me. The person I wanted to talk to at the end of every day was no longer Ethan. And judging by the look in Alexander's eyes when he glanced at me beneath the winter lights, I was not the only one whose rules were beginning to change. January arrived with the kind of cold that made Chicago feel carved from ice. The holidays were over. Decorations disappeared from storefronts. Snow turned gray along the sidewalks. Life settled back into routine. At least mine. Tried to. The difference was that I no longer organized my days around Ethan. The apartment lease ended in 6 weeks, and we both knew neither of us intended to renew it together. The strange thing was how quickly distance changed perspective. Once upon a time, I had built entire weeks around his schedule. Now there were days when I barely thought about him at all. That realization should have made me sad. Instead, it felt freeing. Ethan noticed too. His calls became more frequent. His messages grew longer. What started as apologies slowly transformed into desperation. One evening I returned home to find flowers sitting outside my apartment door. The card contained only 3 words. "Please talk to me." I left them in the hallway. The next morning they were gone. Meanwhile, Alexander continued being exactly who he had always been. Consistent. Calm. Present. He never asked me to choose sides. Never criticized Ethan. Never used his influence to impress me. If anything, he seemed determined to let me make every decision for myself. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. One afternoon my supervisor called me into her office. I assumed I had made a mistake on a project. Instead, she smiled and slid a folder across the desk. "Congratulations. We are promoting you." For several seconds I simply stared at her. The promotion came with a substantial raise and leadership responsibilities I had spent years working toward. Walking out of that office felt surreal. I wanted to call someone immediately. Without thinking, I reached for my phone. Not to call Ethan. To call Alexander. He answered on the second ring. Good news? The fact that he recognized excitement in my voice instantly made me smile. When I told him about the promotion, his response was immediate. I never doubted you would earn it. No surprise. No disbelief. No shock. Just confidence. As though my success had always been inevitable. That evening we celebrated with dinner overlooking the river. Halfway through the meal, I realized something important. Alexander never made me feel smaller so he could feel larger. He never treated my accomplishments like background details. He paid attention. He cared. Cross town. Ethan's life seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. Mutual friends quietly mentioned missed deadlines. Professional mistakes. Missed opportunities. Nothing catastrophic. Just a series of poor decisions that seemed to grow more noticeable every week. For the first time in his life, consequences were catching up to him. One Friday night he appeared outside my building unexpectedly. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just exhausted. Charlotte, please. 5 minutes. That is all I am asking. I agreed because refusing felt cruel. We sat in the lobby while snow drifted past the windows. Ethan looked older than I remembered. Tired. Uncertain. I made mistakes, he admitted. I know that. But you cannot seriously be throwing everything away because of one terrible decision. I studied him for a long moment. Then I finally understood something. The problem was not that he had betrayed me. The problem was that he still did not understand what he had broken. Because trust is never destroyed in a single moment. It disappears piece by piece every time someone chooses themselves over the person who loves them. When I stood to leave, Ethan's expression changed. Fear replaced confidence. Real fear. And as I walked away, I realized something else. He was not afraid of losing our past anymore. He was afraid of watching me build a future without him. By February, the city had begun its slow climb out of winter. Snow still lingered in shaded corners, but the sunlight stayed a little longer each evening. My apartment lease ended on a Friday. I spent the entire day carrying boxes down 3 flights of stairs, determined to start over without looking back. Ethan was not there. We had divided everything weeks earlier. Cleanly. Quietly. Like 2 people dismantling a life neither knew how to save. That night, after the last box was unpacked in my new apartment overlooking a small park on the north side, Alexander showed up carrying takeout and a bottle of sparkling water. No grand entrance. No expensive gifts. Just dinner and company. We sat on the floor because my furniture had not arrived yet. Cardboard boxes surrounded us. The room echoed slightly every time we spoke. It should have felt unfinished. Instead, it felt peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt completely at home. Somewhere between discussing work and arguing about which Chicago pizza place was overrated, the conversation shifted. It happened naturally, the way important conversations often do. I asked him a question I had avoided for weeks. Why me? Alexander looked down at the unopened container in his hands. For several seconds he said nothing. I almost apologized. Then he spoke. Because you never wanted anything from me. The answer surprised me. He continued quietly. Most people see my position first. They see the company, the money, the influence. You were the first person in years who looked at me like I was simply another human being standing in front of a window at a charity gala. I remembered that night immediately. The snow outside. The city lights. The loneliness I had tried so hard to hide. Alexander gave a small laugh. Do you know how many people have tried to set me up over the years? Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Board members. Friends. Family. Even reporters. Then his expression softened. None of them ever mattered. The room suddenly felt very still. Outside, traffic moved through the streets below. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Life continued as normal. Yet something about that moment felt different. Significant. I studied his face. For the first time, I noticed the exhaustion he carried beneath his composure. The loneliness hidden beneath confidence. The years spent protecting himself from disappointment. What happened? I asked gently. Why did you stop letting people get close? His eyes drifted toward the window. When I was younger, I thought if I worked hard enough, succeeded enough, achieved enough, eventually I would feel complete. He smiled faintly. Turns out success is very loud. Loneliness is louder. There was no dramatic tragedy. No shocking secret. Just years of choosing work over connection until the habit became a wall. Listening to him, I realized something important. Alexander was not closed off because he lacked feelings. He was closed off because he had spent too long convincing himself he did not need them. The silence that followed felt warm instead of awkward, comfortable instead of empty. Then he looked directly at me. Charlotte, meeting you changed something I thought was permanent. My heart stumbled. Not because of the words themselves, because I knew he meant every one of them. And sitting there surrounded by moving boxes and unfinished beginnings, I realized that sometimes the people who seem strongest from the outside are simply waiting for someone who makes them feel safe enough to stop carrying everything alone. Spring arrived quietly. One morning I noticed the trees outside my apartment beginning to turn green again, and it struck me how much life could change in a single season. A few months earlier, I had been standing in a coffee shop watching my future collapse through the screen of a phone. Now I was leading projects at work, sleeping peacefully for the first time in years, and building something real with a man who never once asked me to become someone else. The funny thing about healing is that you rarely notice it happening. One day you simply realize the pain no longer wakes up before you do. On a rainy Thursday evening in April, I was finishing dinner with Alexander at my apartment when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Neither of us was expecting visitors. I walked toward the door and glanced through the peephole. My breath caught. Ethan stood outside. Rain soaked through his jacket. Water dripped from his hair. For a moment I considered pretending nobody was home. Instead I opened the door. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had spent months carrying the weight of choices he could no longer undo. Charlotte, he said quietly. I need to talk to you. Behind me, Alexander remained seated in the living room. He did not interrupt. He did not interfere. He simply trusted me to handle the situation myself. That trust meant more than Ethan would ever understand. I stepped outside beneath the covered entrance. Rain tapped softly against the sidewalk and nearby parked cars. The city glowed beneath reflected streetlights. Ethan stared at the ground for several seconds before finally speaking. I was wrong. About everything. The words hung between us. Months ago, I had imagined hearing them. Back then I thought they would fix something. They did not. Because apologies cannot rebuild a bridge after the river has already carried it away. I know I hurt you, he continued. I know I destroyed what we had. But I keep thinking about all the years we spent together. I keep thinking about what my life could have been if I had not thrown it away. His voice cracked slightly. Then something happened that I never expected. Ethan lowered himself onto one knee in the rain. Not because he thought it would change my mind. Not because he believed it would create a dramatic moment. Because regret had finally become heavier than pride. Charlotte, please. If there is any chance at all. Any chance. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I realized I felt no anger. No bitterness. No desire for revenge. Only clarity. The kind that arrives when your heart has already finished making its decision. Ethan, I said gently, you are not losing me tonight. You lost me the moment you stopped valuing what we had. Tears filled his eyes. He nodded slowly because deep down he already knew. Some truths simply take longer to accept. When I returned inside, Alexander looked up from the couch. He did not ask what happened. He only opened his arms. I sat beside him and rested my head against his shoulder. Outside, the rain continued falling across the city. Inside, everything felt calm, safe, certain. And as I listened to the steady rhythm against the windows, I finally understood something that took me years to learn. The greatest victory is not making someone regret losing you. It is becoming so happy that their regret no longer matters.